I called an electrician on a Wednesday morning because one of the outlets in my home office had been sparking for a week. That was it. That was the whole plan for the day. A flickering socket, a quick repair, maybe a sandwich afterward. I had no idea that by nightfall, I would be sitting at my kitchen table with evidence that my own son had been engineering my mental collapse from the inside out. My name isn't important. What matters is that I'm 64 years old, retired after 31 years as a structural engineer, and I live alone in the house my wife and I bought together in Portland, Oregon, back when this neighborhood still had more trees than coffee shops. My wife passed 7 years ago, pancreatic cancer. 4 months from diagnosis to the morning, I held her hand and felt it go still. After that, it was just me and this house and the slow, quiet work of learning how to be a person again. My son is my only child. He's 41, married, with 2 kids I adore. After his mother died, we grew closer in the way that grief sometimes pulls people together, the way 2 people standing at the edge of the same hole instinctively reach for each other. He started calling me every Sunday. He came over for dinner twice a month. When my daughter-in-law suggested they move closer to help me out, I thought it was one of the kindest gestures anyone had ever extended to me. They bought a house 12 minutes away. I thought I was lucky. The first time I couldn't find my car keys, I laughed it off. Everyone misplaces keys. The second time, I was mildly annoyed. The third time, when I found them in the refrigerator sitting on top of the orange juice, I went cold. I'd never in my life put my keys in the refrigerator. I stood there in the kitchen for a long moment staring at them, trying to remember the last 24 hours with the focused desperation of a man who suddenly fears his own mind. My son was sympathetic when I mentioned it, almost too sympathetic. He put his hand on my shoulder and looked at me the way you look at something fragile. "Dad, this happens," he said. "You've been under a lot of stress. Maybe it's time to see someone." I trusted him. I booked an appointment with my doctor. My doctor ran some baseline cognitive tests, nothing alarming, but ordered a follow-up in 3 months, just to track any changes. My son drove me to that appointment. He waited in the lobby and asked detailed questions on the drive home about what the doctor had said, what tests I'd taken, what the follow-up would involve. I remember thinking he was just being attentive. That's what I thought. Attentive. The outlet in my office had been sparking since the previous Friday. I'd taped over it as a temporary fix, and called an electrician recommended by a neighbor, a man named Frank who'd been doing electrical work in the area for over 20 years. Frank arrived at 9 in the morning. A big, quiet man in his 50s with calloused hands and reading glasses. He kept pushing up his nose. I showed him the outlet, made a pot of coffee, and left him to work while I went to read on the back porch. About 40 minutes later, Frank came to find me. He stood in the doorway to the porch and he had an expression I didn't know how to read. It wasn't distress exactly. It was the look of a man who has stumbled into something he didn't bargain for and is trying to figure out the responsible thing to do. "Mr. Sir," he said, and paused. "I found the problem with your outlet. I can have it fixed in another 20 minutes. But there's something else." He stopped again. "Your son was here when I arrived, and your daughter-in-law. They were in your garage when you let me in. I don't think they knew the garage door to the utility room doesn't close all the way. I could hear them clearly from in there." I set my coffee down slowly. "I need you to tell me what you heard," I said. He sat down across from me on the porch, and he was careful and deliberate, the way a man is when he knows the words he's about to say are going to rearrange someone's world. He said he'd been running wire through the utility room that adjoins the garage when he heard my son's voice, loud and agitated, arguing with my daughter-in-law. He said he'd stopped working when he heard my name, and then he kept listening because what he heard made him feel sick in a way he couldn't just walk away from. My son had been arguing with my daughter-in-law about timing. She'd wanted to wait another 2 months. My son said they couldn't afford to wait. The word he used was deteriorating, and he used it about me, and he used it in a way that made clear it was not an observation, but a project, something they were managing, something they had a schedule for. My daughter-in-law mentioned a number, 300,000. My son said that was just the first withdrawal, that once the guardianship went through, they'd have access to everything. The retirement accounts, the house that my wife and I saved for 12 years to buy, the house where my son grew up and learned to ride a bike on the driveway and had his first heartbreak on the front steps. The house worth, in this market, close to $800,000. Frank said my son mentioned something about a third incident. He said they needed one more documented episode before the petition would be strong enough, that the last two were borderline and they needed something more visible. He said my daughter-in-law suggested mentioning it to my doctor at the next visit, that she could come with me and describe what she'd allegedly witnessed. I sat on that porch for a long time after Frank stopped talking, long enough that a bird landed on the railing and looked at me and flew away. I thought about the keys in the refrigerator. I thought about the time I couldn't find my reading glasses for 2 days and found them in the garage in a drawer I never used. I thought about the evening my son had casually filmed me on his phone when I couldn't remember the name of a colleague I'd worked with for years, just a normal tip-of-the-tongue moment, and I'd thought he was trying to show me something on the phone screen. I thought about my wife's china cabinet, which had been moved 2 inches to the left sometime in the past month, so slightly that I'd crashed my shin into the corner of it twice in the dark, confused both times about why my own furniture felt wrong in my own house. I had not been losing my mind. I had been being managed. Frank was watching me with the careful patience of someone waiting to see if a person is going to be all right. I asked him if he would be willing to write down everything he'd heard while it was still fresh, and sign it. He didn't hesitate. He said he'd heard what he'd heard, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. He asked if I wanted him to go to the police with me. I said not yet. I said I needed to be absolutely certain before I made a move I couldn't take back. He fixed the outlet. He wrote down everything he remembered in a detailed, careful statement and signed it with the date and his full name and his contractor license number, because he said he wanted it to be official. He gave me his card and told me to call him whenever I needed, day or night. When he handed me the statement, he looked me in the eye and said, "I've got a father too." That was all. He left, and I sat back down at my kitchen table with a signed statement from a stranger who had just handed me back my life. I spent the rest of that day thinking instead of acting, which went against every instinct I had. I wanted to pick up the phone and call my son and ask him point blank. I wanted to drive to their house and stand in their kitchen and make them look me in the face. But I had been an engineer for 31 years. An engineer does not confront a structural failure with emotion. An engineer determines the full extent of the problem before deciding how to address it. The next morning, I drove to my bank and asked to speak with a manager. I told her I had concerns about unauthorized access to my accounts, and I wanted to know whether anyone had made inquiries about my accounts, my beneficiary designations, or power of attorney documentation in the past year. She pulled the records. My son had visited the branch 6 months ago and spoken with a junior advisor about the process for establishing financial power of attorney for an elderly parent with cognitive decline. He had described me as showing early signs of dementia. He had asked about the timeline for transferring account management. He'd done this 6 months ago. 6 months. I'd eaten dinner at his house 3 weeks after that conversation, helped his youngest with a school science project, and driven home thinking I was the luckiest man alive to have a son who cared. I went from the bank to an estate attorney I found through my accountant, a sharp, efficient woman who had clearly seen everything. I explained the situation from beginning to end and showed her Frank's statement. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "What you're describing is elder financial abuse. Depending on how far they've taken this, it may also constitute fraud, potentially conspiracy to commit fraud. You need to go to the police with what you have, and you need to do it now rather than gathering more evidence on your own. More evidence gathered improperly can compromise a case." I told her I wanted to speak to my son first. She strongly advised against it. I said I understood the risk, but I needed to hear it from him. I needed to know which version of my son had done this. The one I'd raised, or someone I'd never met. She drafted a new will for me that afternoon. I signed it before I left her office. Everything I had, the house, the retirement accounts, the investments, the contents of 31 years of responsible saving went to causes my wife had believed in. The cancer foundation that had tried to save her. The children's hospital where she had volunteered. A scholarship fund for first-generation engineering students at the state university. My son and my daughter-in-law received nothing. When I signed that document, I felt something I hadn't expected, not grief. Something closer to clarity. I called my son that evening and asked him to come over Saturday morning. I said I'd been thinking about the future, and I wanted his advice about my estate planning. His voice lifted in a way that I recognized now for what it was, and the recognition was like a stone in my stomach. He said he'd be there at 10. He said to make sure I ate a good breakfast, that he was worried about me keeping my strength up. I thanked him. I hung up. I sat in my wife's chair in the living room in the dark for a long time and thought about who she would have been in this moment. She had always been the braver one. I called Frank and told him what I'd found. He offered again to come with me to the police. I asked him to wait until after Saturday, so I could speak to my son with everything in hand. He said he'd be ready whenever I needed him. Saturday morning, my son arrived alone. My daughter-in-law had stayed home with the kids, he said. He had a bag of groceries, fresh fruit, a casserole she'd made, a container of soup. The caregiving performance was so seamless, so practiced, that for a single terrible second I almost doubted myself. Then I remembered the bank manager's face as she pulled up the records of his visit, and I sat down and asked him to sit across from me. I put Frank's signed statement on the table between us. I put the bank's documentation of his visit beside it. I put a copy of my attorney's notes beside that. He looked at the papers for a long moment without touching them. I watched something move across his face. Calculation, I think. Running through options, measuring exits. "Dad," he started. "Don't," I said. "Please do not call me that right now." He looked up. Whatever he was going to say, he didn't say it. He just sat back in his chair and looked at the table. "I want to understand," I said. "I want to hear it from you. Not because it'll change anything, because it won't, but because you're my son, and I raised you, and I want to look you in the eye and hear you tell me why." The silence stretched. Then my son let out a long breath and rubbed his face with both hands, and when he put his hands back down, something in his expression had shifted. The performance was gone. What was left underneath it was not remorse. It was exhaustion, and something that looked disturbingly like resentment. "You have no idea what things cost now," he said. "You live in this house that's worth nearly $1 million. You have a pension, you have retirement accounts, you have investments. You have enough money for 3 lifetimes, and you live alone, and you go to your book club and your alumni dinners, and you're going to die someday and leave it all to strangers anyway, so what does it matter when?" I looked at my son, this man I had coached at Little League and driven to college orientation, and stood next to at the altar at his wedding, and I heard him describe my death as a scheduling inconvenience. "We're underwater," he continued. "The investment properties, the business, everything I did, everything right, and the market we're behind on 2 mortgages. We owe more than I can tell my wife sometimes. We need help now, not in 15 years when you decide to die, on your own timeline. You could have asked me for help." "I did ask you." His voice cracked. "I asked you last Thanksgiving and you said you were worried about enabling dependency. I asked you again in February and you offered me a loan with interest. A loan. From my own father. So you decided to have me declared incompetent instead." He didn't answer. "You moved things in my house," I said. "You hid my keys. You filmed me when you thought I was confused. You told my bank I had dementia. You had your wife preparing to attend my doctor's appointments to describe symptoms I don't have. We were going to take care of you," he said. And the worst part was that I think on some level he believed it. "You would have been comfortable. We would have made sure of that. You were going to steal my mind and then steal my life while I was too confused to stop you." He didn't have an answer for that. I picked up my phone and I called the police. Right there, with him sitting across the table from me, he stared at me while it rang. I think part of him had genuinely believed I wouldn't do it, that being his father would stop me. I told the dispatcher that I needed to report elder financial abuse and fraud and conspiracy, and I gave my address, and I asked them to send someone soon. My son stood up. I told him to sit back down. I told him that if he walked out that door, the sealed confession my attorney was holding would be opened that same day and filed with everything else, and that leaving now would only make things worse for him when they caught up with him. He stood for a moment in the middle of my living room, and then he sat back down. He put his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands, and he sat there like that until the officers arrived. The investigation took 2 months. My daughter-in-law, when interviewed separately, told the investigators that she had raised objections in the early stages, and that my son had pushed forward over her protests. Whether that was entirely true, or whether she was adjusting her story to protect herself, I don't know. The bank records, Frank's statement, the audio my attorney had recorded during my son's interview with her, the documentation of his visit to the bank, it was, according to the detective assigned to the case, one of the cleaner elder fraud cases he'd worked. Clear intent, documented pattern, multiple witnesses. My son was charged with elder financial abuse, conspiracy to commit fraud, and 1 count related to the falsification of representations made to a financial institution. My daughter-in-law was charged separately. The criminal proceedings are ongoing. I won't follow them closely. I have a lawyer who will do that for me. My grandchildren are with my daughter-in-law's parents for now. I have called them twice. They are confused and frightened. And that is the part of this that keeps me awake at night, the part that cannot be fixed by evidence or attorneys or criminal charges. They are children who did nothing and who will spend years untangling the damage of what their parents chose. I cannot undo that. All I can do is remain something steady in their lives, if they want that from me someday. A week after the arrest, I drove to Frank's shop. He was replacing a breaker panel for a customer and came out to the parking lot in his work jacket, wiping his hands on a rag, squinting against the morning sun. I handed him an envelope. He looked at it. "What is this?" he said. "Open it." He opened it. He stood there for a moment reading the letter from my attorney explaining what was inside. It was a check. The amount was not insignificant. I had also, as of the previous Thursday, added a provision to my will, establishing a trade scholarship in my wife's name at the local vocational college, and Frank's name was in the document as the person I wished to be consulted about criteria. He had been an electrician for 23 years. He would know what kind of student deserved a hand up. Frank looked at the check and then looked at me. "You don't have to do this," he said. "You saved my life," I said. Not dramatically. "You didn't pull me from a burning building. You just decided that what you heard mattered, and that I mattered, even though you didn't know me. That is worth more than I can put in an envelope, but I'd like to try." He shook my hand for a long time, the way men of a certain age shake hands, when neither of them is willing to say what they actually feel. Then he went back inside, and I drove home. The house is quieter than it's been in years, but it is a different kind of quiet than before. Before, the quiet had a layer of performance underneath it, the Sunday calls, the dinners, the carefully timed expressions of concern that I now understand were reconnaissance. Now the quiet is just what it is. My house, my things in their proper places, my mind intact. My doctor ran a full cognitive assessment after everything came out. Every result was normal. There was nothing wrong with me that 7 years of grief and 1 very bad year of being gaslit by my own son had not manufactured. When she called with the results, she paused and said, "I want you to know that I'm sorry I didn't see this sooner, that I let them bring me into this." She hadn't known she was being used. She hadn't known what the questions from my son during those phone consultations were really for, but I accepted her apology because she was not the architect of any of it, and because blame distributed too widely dilutes itself into something useless. I still live in this house. I will probably die in this house, on my own timeline, of something ordinary and statistical, the way most people do. In the meantime, I have my book club, my alumni engineering dinners, my Friday morning walks along the river, and a friendship with an electrician who tells me about the worst wiring he finds in old houses and makes me feel better about every decision I've ever made. People ask me sometimes whether I regret calling the police, whether I wish I'd handled it privately, the way some families do, absorbing the wound and carrying it in silence. The answer is no. I regret that it became necessary. I regret that the son I raised made choices that required me to choose between protecting myself and protecting him, and that when I chose myself, I was choosing correctly. I regret that his children will grow up with that shadow over their childhood. I do not regret that the law stepped in to do what the law exists to do. Here is what I think, after all of it. Desperation is real. Financial ruin is real. I do not doubt that my son was drowning, that the gap between the life he had imagined and the life he was living had grown into something he felt he couldn't survive. I understand desperation. I watched my wife fight for her life with everything she had, and I called that courage. What my son did was not courage. What my son did was choose to preserve his comfort by dismantling mine. Those are not the same thing, and dressing one up as the other is how decent people talk themselves into indecent choices. If there is something useful in any of this, I think it is this. Pay attention to the pattern, not the individual moments. Any one of those incidents, the keys, the glasses, the moved furniture, could have been nothing. It is the pattern that tells the truth. And if someone in your life is consistently making you doubt your own mind, it is worth asking who benefits from that doubt. Trust is not a gift you give once. It is something you verify, quietly, over time, by watching whether people's actions match their words. My son's words were always warm. His actions, when I finally looked at them clearly, were a map of something else entirely. I am 64 years old. I am healthy. I have money I earned, and a house I own, and a mind that works exactly as it should. I have years ahead of me that belong to me, and I intend to use them deliberately and without apology. My wife would have said, "Good." She was always the braver one, but she would have said, "I did all right." Somewhere out there, I know there are others sitting with a nagging feeling they can't quite name, a sense that something is wrong in a relationship they trusted, a pattern of small incidents they keep dismissing, a voice in their own head they've been taught not to believe. If that's you, I want you to hear me say, trust that feeling. Ask the questions. Look at the pattern. And if someone saves you the way Frank saved me, if someone sees you when they didn't have to, and speaks up when it would have been easier to stay quiet, let them know it mattered. That's not a small thing. That's the whole thing. Where in the world are you watching from? And has someone ever said something to you, a stranger, a neighbor, someone with nothing to gain, that ended up changing everything? Tell me in the comments. And if this story resonated with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. We'll see you in the next one.